So Lynn, thank you for coming and thinking with me today about what a unit of study is. Some of us in our writing instruction talk about planning units of study, but I think all of us have a different understanding of what a unit of study is. And you told me earlier, before we started recording this, that you have heard people kind of use the term in different ways. What are some of the ways that you've heard teachers talk about units of study?
I guess my confusion comes from the fact that I'm not clear on exactly what a unit of study refers to. And in the past, I've heard it referenced as far as putting together learning for EL students, which has more of a thematic basis. But I've also heard it referenced in regards to addressing standards, perhaps, or in writing, maybe a genre, such as narrative writing. So I guess I'm not clear what the focus of a unit of study is and how we want to define a unit of study when we're using it together in our district.
Mm-hmm. And I think for our purposes today, I'm thinking about writing.
Okay.
I think a reading unit would have different frames for me to think about in determining what my outcomes are going to be and what my focus is going to be. So I almost see myself working through a different lens, so to speak, in my head for a reading unit of study as opposed to a writing unit of study.
Okay.
And I remember the days of themes. I remember when I taught first grade, I was heavily using thematic topics, right? Bears for a week or bats for a week. And I thought of my units based on themes. Maybe the first difference, Lynn, we can think about is the actual idea of study.
Okay.
So a unit of study meaning there is something that we are all looking closely at, studying together, learning from, that is determining the goals, the end product, the use of the time in this unit that we have together. So maybe we should start there rather than looking at time. So hopefully most of our teachers know that Common Core did publish an appendix with exemplars of the 3 different text types of student writing in them. Have you seen teachers work with these much at all?
I've only seen them working with text types in terms of our prior content standards. I'm aware of what the text types are that are emphasized now in the new Common Core and how that strand continues from early on up through 12th grade. But, how to organize to teach those strands, I guess, is the big question. And what's addressed in each of those types of writing, and then how the process plays into that.
Yes. So, exactly. And that's where designing a unit of study can be helpful.
Okay.
So a lot of teachers are starting with a narrative. I think that's one we're more familiar with.
Which makes sense, yes, because that one is something that most teachers have done for a long time.
Right. So let's say we're thinking about an 8th grade unit of study. What would be helpful is considering what Common Core defines as an exemplar piece of writing in that particular text type at that particular grade level. And what's nice about the exemplars that Common Core has provided is that they annotate these as well. So they list for us the particular pieces of the writing that engage the reader, that showed logical sequence, that have the techniques that they are looking for students to master in that grade level, in that particular text type.
So they're listing the elements of that particular text type that need to be present in that particular piece of writing.
Yes.
Okay.
We have them in the standards, and then we have them a second time in the exemplars. So they kind of bring them to life a little bit.
That leads me to ask, would then sort of a sequence for teaching derive from these exemplars? And does that become, in a sense, the construct of the unit of study to some degree?
To some degree, absolutely, because I can study this piece of writing with my students, and we can use a bit of inquiry, look together, how did this particular writer engage the reader? How did this particular writer sequence the events so that we could follow them closely? Katie Wood-Ray calls it reading like a writer. So we can use, and what's great about these are they're authentic student samples, so they're approachable for our kids, and deconstruct in a way, I guess would be the word I'm thinking of, Lynn, what this writer did so that we then can mimic those same kind of moves in our own writing. So that would be the study portion.
I see. That makes sense.
Without looking closely at some kind of exemplar, sample, whatever we want to call it, mentor text is another word that's used in that place. It's not really a unit of study. We have units of instruction that sometimes don't rely on study, when I just get in front of the class and say, this is an introduction, now write an introduction. This is how to sequence events, now do this. And we do that quite a bit. But there is something, I know even as an adult, if I'm asked to write a resume, and I haven't done one in a while, I'm going to pull up a few so that I have an idea of what exactly I'm trying to accomplish.
And use that as my guide. Or at least jumping off point.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think it brings me comfort as a teacher, Lynn, because sometimes I'm not all that confident about my writing ability personally. So when I can rely on another teacher in their room of sorts to show my students what to do, it relieves some anxiety for me, that I don't have to know everything about everything, but I can use another teacher to demonstrate and show what that skill looks like.
And I'm thinking, too, that since this is a piece of student-written text, often it's more relatable to the students than adult writing is. I just know that when I've written in front of students, my own style of writing, the language I use, without intending to be, is sometimes a little bit more sophisticated. And so not as relatable, perhaps, as seeing a peer piece of writing, and perhaps can give students more confidence than they might otherwise have in studying a piece of text that's well written, but written with the voice of a peer. Yes. The topic is relatable, the voice is relatable, the language is often relatable. It's a little bit of that I+1 more than I+25. Exactly. 50. A little more friendly.
Yeah. Now, what's nice about using an exemplar right from the Common Core standards is that the actual standards are, what could I say, heightened or made very concrete, both for the teacher and the students. In using another mentor text, I know I could find dialogue, pacing, description in probably any quality narrative that I bring in for my students to look at. But here it's very overt, and the other, I would just need to spend a little bit extra time identifying those particular things and helping my students to identify those same items.
Well, especially the first time through, it seems like it would be much easier and for the teacher to begin with something where the links are clearly made between what the standard is asking for and what this particular piece of text demonstrates. And then from there go perhaps to another piece of text, and with the help of the students almost begin to make those links.
Yes.
So
everyone is learning together.
Exactly. And you can be confident that you're teaching what you need to, that kids are learning what they need to, and that it's done in a way where those links are clear and the examples are accurate.
So I think that helps define the study part.
Okay.
Right, Lynn? That we're actually
it does for
looking
me.
at some text that's the type that we're aiming for in this particular unit. So if I was doing a narrative and asking the children to write a picture book that was a narrative, more than likely we would be looking at a picture book. If we were looking to write memoir, a more sophisticated narrative, I'd have the students studying memoir, whatever form, whether it be an informational news article or website or blog, my study then is going to have that same form. So it's very concrete and explicit, exactly what we're all aiming for by the end of this unit together.
That makes sense.
Okay. And then the other, since we kind of define study, is unit, meaning not one lesson, but a sequence of lessons all toward this same aim. And my goals are standards based.
Okay.
It's really difficult for me personally, I don't know about you, Lynn, but to address in one unit all of the standards for that area. So I'm probably choosing from the standards and from what I know about my students, the real areas of importance in their learning. The areas where I can see from the formative assessment that I've already done what skills they really need to develop in this particular area. And in writing, we always are going to be thinking about conventions. So I want to focus on the grade level appropriate and, again, student needed conventions that they need to learn. And here, this area for mentor text just reminds me that I am going to be looking closely with the students at some example of exactly what I'm asking them to produce.
Now, this mentor text example, is that beyond what the piece of writing we just looked at, or is it just that piece of student writing?
I know that some teachers, often earlier grades, 3rd and 4th, give a couple of mentor texts as samples, and they might read 2. We have to help the students just enjoy the piece and understand it, usually before we can have them analyze it for writing. But it really wouldn't be about quantity as much as about how deeply we're reading this as writers. It's really different, even for me, looking at an article or an essay and trying to see what the writer did as opposed to reading it for understanding. For me, it takes a bit longer. And so, since I know that process takes longer, I don't want to have my kids looking at a lot of mentor text, because then we have a lot of fun reading all these cool things, but we don't really get past the surface level understanding to read like a writer and see, well, what did the writer do that was effective?
So often then it's sounding like the mentor text would be a piece of published text, a book, perhaps a short book or an article or something like that, written by a published writer. Okay.
And this is a nice way for me to differentiate. Sometimes I have a group of RSP kids or a group of beginner English language learners or even early intermediates that the grade level standards are a bit beyond their English acquisition level. So I can maybe choose 3 mentor texts.
Oh, I see.
One that would serve for as a goal bar for my RSP and early intermediate kids, another for the general overall population, and then one maybe that's a bit more sophisticated for my kids who need challenge, who can already do a lot of the skills that the middle mentor text is showing. So I have another teacher for that group so they can even develop more sophistication in their writing. In my fantasy land, I would have 3 for every unit of study for that
so
purpose.
There's almost a tiered examples of perhaps I'll use the word sophistication or application of what this might look like depending on the level of the writer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what a help in differentiating for my students.
Yes.
Because that means that I can keep referring them to that specific text to help determine the length, the form, the word choice, the sophistication, the word that you used. Yeah.
I love that the material we're using assists the teacher in differentiation so that she's not trying to have to figure out how to differentiate her delivery of a lesson, that the material that's used as an example does that for her, and she can teach her lesson but use these different examples that are appropriate for the learning level of the student at a particular time, and that they may even move to looking at one of the more challenging pieces of writing at a later time and get something from it, that they can be growing as a writer in so many different ways in their ability to really appreciate a level of writing that they couldn't before and then replicate that.
Yes. It's a very comforting thing to have those other teachers in a way in the room.
It is,
through
and
just the
that's
material
exactly what they are. And do a better job than most of us could do as writers ourselves.
Very true. Very true. And then I think the only other consideration in defining unit, Lynn, would be process is how I structure my daily lessons. So the only thing that may be different about a unit of study as opposed to a unit without study is I'm going to really begin the unit with some work in immersion. Probably 2 or 3 days of immersing ourselves in that mentor text, reading it closely, studying it, determining how the author, what kinds of techniques the author used that were effective or less effective. Really studying the opening and closing, I know, is something teachers like to do a lot because that's tough for kids. How do I start? How do I finish? I've already said everything there is to say. So those 3 days, I really highly recommend doing an on-demand assessment at the beginning of the unit, because that lets me kind of sort the kids into areas of need. Who really needs the basic structural understanding and who's ready for more sophisticated narrative technique, and what's a need that the whole group has to really help me form my whole group mini lessons.
And would that be sort of a quick write to a prompt or something else?
I would probably do an on-demand.
Okay.
Yes, I would give a prompt.
Okay.
Because that way it wouldn't be, well, it would be kind of leveling the playing field, right?
Yes.
They all have the same thinking, and what do they all do with the same kind of thinking I'm asking them to communicate on the paper with me.
Okay.
After the immersion work, another difference in the units of study that I've looked at lately would be the idea of collecting. We know that students love choice.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Which is hard for us as teachers. But the idea of collecting a variety of topics on which I can write in this text type is really motivating to kids.
Okay.
Rather than always assigning what they're going to be writing on. There are times we have to assign, and there are times in life we all have to write about certain things, but units are a nice time to provide some sort of choice. Probably structured choice. If we're studying narrative, we're all going to think of topics that are narrative driven, but there still is choice in that.
I like that.
Me too. I'm all about choice. So that's probably a few days as well. Then we choose one of those ideas, topics to write about, and then we develop it. Often, when we move right into drafting, we as teachers become frustrated because they hesitate to revise those drafts later. They don't want to put in all that quality.
That's very
stuff.
true.
They've got it all down. It's done. So we can kind of circumvent that by having a phase of developing where we develop effective dialogue between characters. We develop painting a setting and the scene. We develop internal thinking. Some teachers use thinking maps like flow maps, even brace maps to really elaborate on the critical part in the piece, getting kids to insert internal thinking, feeling, show not tell, all that good stuff. If we teach it in a developing phase, or even have students orally develop with those elements in mind, there's a much better chance they'll get on the paper when they start drafting.
Okay. I like that. It's starting with some of what needs to happen in terms of thinking, right?
Yes.
Before you're actually putting words on paper, which for some reason seems harder to change once it's down on paper than if you allow yourself as a writer the time to sort of let it percolate, is the word I like to use. That's what works for me, letting it percolate. And maybe I'm taking notes or using some kind of a thinking map or other kind of organizational chart to collect, I guess, all that thinking.
Yes.
But I'm not putting it in the format of sentence structure that happens once I begin my draft.
And oral language, we've noticed, is such a big component of Common Core. So this is a great opportunity for us to develop more sophisticated vocabulary that can go into the draft, the ideas that are more challenging for those 7th and 8th graders to include in a narrative. How does narrative become more sophisticated? Well, let's practice before you even get started writing so that we can be sure to show that then when you've written your piece.
And all that's fresh.
Yeah. So that developing is probably going to take a few days as well, because there's a lot in every text type that we really need to learn.
Now back to our elements of whatever that type of writing was that we saw here in the outline for the Common Core. Are some of those things being addressed in this developing stage? Is that where some of that's happening?
More than likely, I'm using my developing time to focus on these standards-based goals because I want them included in every student's piece of writing. And then I can also use my revision stage to again address them. As people, we need repetition often, don't
we? Absolutely. Well, clarity comes.
Hopefully.
As we work with ideas.
Then we can move into drafting. And if we've chosen a topic that we really care about, are vested in, and we've developed that over a sustained amount of time, the drafting really shouldn't take that long.
Right.
We've already thought through this idea repeatedly, hopefully with different people, orally, in graphic form. So usually that should be a part of the process that happens pretty quickly.
And sort of flows.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Yeah, we've got all this great stuff. Now let's get it all down on paper. And then we can move into revision. And that probably will take a few days because hopefully we're making some major revisions, really re-seeing the work, not just changing a couple words here and there, but really trying that lead a few other ways and taking out whole paragraphs and structuring them in a completely new way so that they can see that sometimes the first way isn't always the best way.
Is that done with a partner? Is that done with a small group? Is that done through author's chair? Or is this a whole nother topic to go into?
Well, I think all of those places that you mentioned, it absolutely could happen in.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers I'm working with now are really using partners for revision, because if I'm going to trust you to help me change my piece, there has to be some kind of relationship there. We often, I don't know why, maybe it's our human nature, find that when we open up revision to everyone, it doesn't feel as authentic. I need you to really know what I'm trying to communicate to my reader to help me make the changes that will be better changes. And sometimes if I don't know the piece really well or what it's really trying to communicate, I can't be so helpful in revising. I can be helpful in editing, but for revision, I think it's a little better process if the students really know what that piece of writing is trying to do out in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. And what occurred to me as you were talking was what can happen if too many people are involved in revision and you get too many ideas and too many voices. You can almost lose the intent that the author has if the author chooses to follow the suggestions of too many people involved in the revision process, and the writing becomes something entirely different than what it was intended to be. Whereas when it's a partner and there's a clear understanding of what this writing is and a relationship perhaps with the writer, it seems like the chances of the revision enhancing the writing is much greater than it would be otherwise, where sometimes the writing can actually be diluted.
Yes.
And lose its power. So yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this, because it helps me understand the value of partner work.
Very, very valuable, I think. And what you said about purpose, in Common Core we also see that the writers understand the task, the purpose, and the audience. And revision is all about purpose. How do I know what to change? Well, what I changed is based on the purpose of this particular piece of writing, what I'm attempting to do as the writer.
Okay.
In that editing phase, which comes next, I think we can have a lot of eyes. The more eyes, the better. I don't think teachers should be editing much at all.
Okay.
I don't know how students learn anything by me spending hours going through placing all the punctuation where it should be. But they do really, if there's some sort of community that we've developed in the classroom, they want to help each other. And they can look for those surface features in any piece of text. They should be practicing that skill.
Yeah. It occurs to me, too, that experience with lots of different writing is good preparation for state testing.
Yes. And
it's very meaningful and authentic, rather than being just an exercise.
Yes, and it's something that people ask us to do in the real world all
Absolutely.
the time. All the time.
Absolutely.
Then we move into some sort of publishing, which for middle school probably looks like computer work of some type, word processing, that piece. Younger grades, probably not so much in K1, 2, but thinking of how to fancy that up, fix that up, get it ready for a wider audience to view it. And I think if teachers can find ways to make that audience outside of the classroom to some degree, it really gives more purpose to the writing.
Yeah, more validity and importance too. If I'm thinking that this is going to be read by a wider audience, then I have to feel my writing means more than it would be if it were just being read by me or by a small group. One quick question, Des. It's appearing to me as if once this piece of writing is chosen, then that one piece of writing is taken all the way through the process. Is that the way you see this happening, or would more than one piece of writing be at these different stages of development, and once you get to publishing, perhaps not every piece is published?
I think in my fantasy land, Lynn, especially students in the middle grades would be working on a few pieces of writing. I know that this process is a bit new learning for us as educators, let alone our students. So sometimes to make it feasible for myself, the first time I go through, I am having everyone work on one piece the entire time. But really my hope would be by the third time I'm using this process, that students are working on multiple pieces of writing, and it's probably the majority are publishing one of those, but maybe my kids who are a gate or who need more challenge, maybe even publishing more than one piece.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then we celebrate. I don't think we do that enough in school.
I agree. Well, I think we celebrate maybe the wrong things. It's nice to be celebrating learning.
Yes. And that's it, Lynn, celebrating what we learned.
Yeah.
You know, maybe we have a little circle where everyone reads their most effective line for everyone else to hear, or we've really been working on transitional phrases. So we all choose our favorite. Maybe they just walk around with Post-its and comment on each other's writing, and then we reflect on, wow, we all met our deadline. We all did this really difficult work, and we did it well. So let's take a minute to breathe together, let the teacher breathe for a day, and celebrate what was done. And then I would do another on demand.
Oh, great. Okay, to see the difference.
This published piece doesn't really tell me what the students learned. It tells me what teaching they attempted to do. But the comparison between this and this is a true demonstration of learning. What did they internalize from that entire unit and apply independent of when I'm there coaching them into doing higher quality work?
So what they can do on their own, basically. Yeah.
And I can do the same exact prompt that I gave at the beginning of the unit, at the end of the unit. I don't need to come up with a whole new prompt every time, but the students do need to show me that they can do more now or better quality now than they could before we went through this entire process of study together.
This seems very clear to me. I have a much better idea of what a unit of study looks like, and I can see some things that look familiar. But also, I guess, the fact that there's this sort of structure, it appears, to the way the unit of study unfolds. And so my question would be, with different kinds of writing, would this same sort of structure be used?
I think that's the beauty of this for me, Lynn, is I would use the exact same structure for informational, for argument, for narrative, for creative writing. And I know that my goals based on the standards are going to change. Hopefully my conventions are changing as they develop. My mentor text will change to reflect the type of writing that we're doing, but I can use this same structure over and over and over again, which for me is very comforting. There's some stability in the way I frame every unit of study that way.
For me too, and also from the student's point of view, it's very predictable, which I think helps with learning. At the same time, that because the type of writing is different, there's more variety, and the fact that there is choice in the process gives the student a sense of control over what's happening. But the structure is predictable, and so that is a comfort that makes me think, oh, I don't have to sort of start from scratch. And that's very, very helpful. One last question I have, I guess, would be in terms of mentor texts, which seem like a really important aspect of this, because that's what I'm looking at to learn from in terms of different kinds of writing. And so where do the titles for mentor texts come from? Do they come with the standards? Is that something that, we as a district or as a school need to talk about, or what's your thinking on that?
There is a lot of information out there, and that would be a good conversation for us to have. I know a lot of sites have professional texts. I'm thinking of Ralph Fletcher's craft lessons and nonfiction craft lessons that have particular titles in those books. I've shown teachers a book called Mentor Texts that lists mentor texts by grade level, which is very helpful. And the same authors have a titled Nonfiction Mentor Text. So the sources are out there. Thankfully, we have professionals who've done the work of finding really quality texts that match standards for different grade levels. And maybe one day we can just sit down and look at a couple grade level strands together of those mentor texts and talk together about what makes those really quality mentor texts for teachers to be using.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.